In this unit, we're shifting from sourcing and supplier selection into what happens after a supplier is chosen, contract management. Contracts are not just legal documents, they are governance tools that shape supplier behavior, risk sharing, and long-term performance. While contracts try to anticipate future events, the reality is that no contract can ever be fully complete. That's why managing contracts effectively is just as important as negotiating them. By the end of this unit, there are 4 key outcomes you should be able to demonstrate. First, you should understand the different types of contracts that exist and why organizations choose one over another. Second, you should be able to explain when long-term contracts make sense and when they don't. Third, we'll look at contract types used in non-traditional or complex spending areas, such as services, technology, and uncertain environments. Finally, you should understand alternatives to legal action for resolving contractual disputes, recognizing that litigation is rarely the best first option. One of the biggest misconceptions about contracts is the idea that once a contract is signed, the work is done. In reality, that's when the real work begins. Contracts cannot predict every future condition, especially in dynamic supply chains. As a result, effective contract management requires ongoing relationship management. In some cultures and industries, the relationship itself may carry more weight than the written terms. In those cases, rigid legal enforcement can actually damage performance rather than improve it. This is why contract management must balance formal legal structure with trust, communication, and adaptability. At its core, a purchase contract establishes the rules of engagement between buyer and supplier. It defines the terms and conditions under which business is conducted, clarifies roles and responsibilities, and sets expectations for performance. Importantly, contracts also define the type of relationship, transactional, collaborative, or strategic, and create a mechanism for mutual benefit rather than unilateral advantage. Most contracts begin with formal legal language identifying the parties involved, their legal standing, and their locations. While this may seem routine, precision here matters. Incorrect legal identification can create enforceability issues later. This opening section establishes who is legally responsible and under which jurisdictions the agreement operates. Contracts are typically organized into standardized sections. These include definitions, scope of agreement, delivery and payment terms, liability, force majeure, and termination clauses. Additional sections may address intellectual property, confidentiality, performance metrics, governing law, and compliance requirements. Appendices often contain schedules, technical specifications, or performance benchmarks. The structure is designed to make complex agreements clear, enforceable, and adaptable. Most organizations begin with standardized contract templates developed in collaboration with legal counsel. However, a common mistake is reusing old contracts without sufficient modification. Just because a contract worked before does not mean it fits the current situation. Each agreement should reflect the specific risk profile, market conditions, and relationship dynamics involved. Substantial customization is often necessary. International contracts introduce additional complexity. Key considerations include which country's laws apply, where disputes will be resolved, the currency used for payment, and the official contract language. Force majeure clauses are contract provisions that excuse parties from performing their obligations due to extraordinary, unforeseen events beyond their control, such as natural disasters, war, or pandemics. They prevent liability for non-performance, allowing for suspension or termination of the contract. These become especially important internationally, as political instability, natural disasters, or war can significantly disrupt performance. Now that you know a little bit more about elements of a contract, let's move on to discussing different types of contract. Broadly speaking, contracts fall into 2 major categories: fixed-price contracts and cost-based contracts. The choice between them depends on uncertainty, risk tolerance, and the supplier's ability to control costs. Each structure shifts risk differently between buyer and supplier, where fixed-price contracts tend to have lower buyer risk and higher supplier risk, with the opposite for cost-based contracts. Let's discuss each of these in more detail, and you'll see why each differs based on buyer risk and supplier risk. Firm fixed-price contracts are the simplest and most common form. The price does not change regardless of market conditions. This structure places cost risk on the supplier in rising markets and on the buyer in declining markets. Because suppliers may include contingency buffers, buyers must understand underlying market conditions before selecting this contract type. Fixed-price contracts with escalation are used for longer-term agreements where costs are expected to change over time. Escalation clauses allow prices to adjust upward or downward based on an external objective index, such as commodity prices or inflation rates. This helps maintain fairness while preserving cost predictability. When costs or quantities cannot be accurately estimated upfront, fixed-price contracts with redetermination are used. An initial target price is established using best guess estimates. At a predetermined point, both parties review actual performance and renegotiate the final price based on real data. Fixed price with incentives contracts encourage cost savings by allowing buyers and suppliers to share efficiency gains, often on a 50-50 basis. They are especially useful for high-cost, long lead time items where supplier innovation can significantly reduce total cost. Cost-based contracts shift economic risk from the supplier to the buyer. They are typically used when uncertainty is high, and fixed pricing would require excessive contingency fees. To be effective, these contracts require clear definitions of allowable costs and strong cost control mechanisms. Often these contracts need to include terms and conditions that require the supplier to carefully monitor and control the costs. They are also applicable when goods or services are expensive, complex, or important to the buyer, and there is a high degree of uncertainty. In the cost plus incentive fee structure, suppliers are reimbursed for allowable costs and receive incentive payments based on cost performance. Additionally, these may include cost savings sharing at a predetermined rate between buyers and suppliers. This works best when both parties have confidence in initial cost estimates and want to encourage efficiency without excessive risk. Under cost-sharing contracts, allowable costs are split between buyer and supplier according to a predetermined percentage. Clear operating guidelines and performance expectations are essential, particularly in periods of rising prices. Time and materials contracts are common in maintenance and repair services. They are based on agreed-upon labor rates plus overhead and profit. Because buyer cost control is limited, these contracts typically include a not-to-exceed ceiling. Typically, there is low buyer control over estimated maximum price. Finally, in the cost-plus fixed-fee contract, the supplier is reimbursed for costs up to a limit and receives a fixed fee regardless of performance. While this guarantees supplier profitability, it provides little incentive for cost control unless additional productivity goals are included. People tend to ask, which contract is best? But that's the wrong question. In supply chain management, there is no universally best contract. A contract only makes sense relative to the environment you're operating in. What we're really doing when we select a contract is deciding who is going to carry the risk: the buyer, the supplier, or both. The figure you're looking at compares three major contract types: a fixed-price contract, an incentive contract, and a cost-based contract. You can think of them as sitting on a spectrum. A fixed-price contract puts most of the risk on the supplier. A cost-based contract puts most of the risk on the buyer. And an incentive contract shares the risk between them. Imagine first that you're buying something where the market price itself is unstable. Think about semiconductors during shortages, medical equipment during COVID, or commodities like rare metals. The supplier doesn't actually know what their own costs will be in 6 months. If you force a fixed price in that situation, you're essentially asking the supplier to gamble. To protect themselves, they'll either refuse the deal, add a huge cushion to the price, or later fail to perform. That's why fixed-price contracts are a poor fit when market uncertainty is high. Instead, buyers move toward cost-based contracts. In those agreements, the buyer agrees to pay the supplier's actual cost plus a fee. That sounds scary at first, but what it really does is allow the work to proceed without the supplier being punished for unpredictable inputs. Incentive contracts often appear here as a compromise, sharing some of that uncertainty rather than pushing it entirely onto one party. Now think about time. Suppose the relationship will last 5 years. The longer the agreement, the less anyone can predict inflation, labor rates, regulations, or technology changes. A fixed-price contract over a long horizon almost guarantees that one side eventually loses money. Because of that, long-term relationships usually shift away from fixed price and toward cost-based or incentive arrangements. These allow adjustments as the world changes. You're not locking two organizations into assumptions that will definitely become wrong. Now for something more counterintuitive, trust. Many people assume high trust means locking in a price. In reality, high trust actually makes cost-based contracts possible. Cost-based agreements require transparency. The supplier essentially opens their books. They show labor, materials, overhead, everything. A buyer would never accept that information without trust, and a supplier would never reveal it without trust either. When trust is low, buyers protect themselves with fixed-price contracts. When trust is high, they can collaborate and use cost-based contracts because neither party fears opportunism. Now consider innovation or technology uncertainty. Think about R&D a new IT system or designing a new product. Here's the core problem. We don't actually know what the final work will require yet. If we don't know what work will be done, we cannot accurately price it. When firms try to force fixed-price contracts onto innovative projects, suppliers respond predictably. They overprice, cut corners, or the project collapses. Cost-based contracts work much better in these situations because they allow learning and iteration. Incentive contracts also help because they reward progress and milestones rather than pretending everything is predictable at the beginning. Now shift to a different condition, the supplier's ability to influence costs. Suppose the supplier can dramatically reduce costs through better engineering, logistics improvements, or process innovation. A pure cost-based contract actually creates a problem here. If every dollar spent is reimbursed, the supplier has little motivation to economize. This is exactly where incentive contracts shine. They share savings. The supplier earns more when they lower costs, and the buyer benefits as well. You're aligning behavior rather than policing it. Finally, consider very large purchases, aircraft, infrastructure, or major defense systems. When the dollar value becomes enormous, financial exposure becomes dangerous. A supplier cannot realistically absorb massive unexpected losses. If they go bankrupt, the buyer's project fails anyway. Because of that, buyers often prefer cost-based or incentive contracts for very high-value purchases. These structures keep the supplier financially viable while still encouraging performance. Now that you know about the contract types as well as key criteria for choosing certain contracts over others, let's talk about what happens if there is a dispute. Disputes are inevitable, especially in complex high-value contracts. Rather than defaulting to litigation, contracts should specify dispute resolution mechanisms. Legal action should always be the last resort. Dispute resolution options range from negotiation and mediation to arbitration. The various types of resolutions are depicted in this table. The appropriate choice depends on relationship importance, cost, time pressure, and desired outcomes. Key considerations include emotional intensity, need for precedent, confidentiality, time constraints, and credibility of available evidence. Choosing the wrong mechanism can damage both performance and relationships. Let's close by revisiting each of the learning objectives for this unit and summarizing what we covered. First, we focused on understanding the different types of contracts that exist. We examined fixed-price and cost-based contracts along with their variations and discussed how each structure allocates risk differently between buyers and suppliers. The key takeaway is that contract choice is a strategic decision, not just a pricing decision, and must reflect uncertainty, cost control, and supplier capability. Second, we developed an understanding of long-term contracts and when they should be used. We discussed how long-term agreements can provide assurance of supply, access to supplier technology, and learning curve efficiencies, while also recognizing their risks, including supplier complacency and forecasting uncertainty. Effective long-term contracts require active management, flexibility, and well-designed contingency clauses. Third, we explored contract types used in non-traditional and complex spending areas, such as services, maintenance, and high-uncertainty environments. Contracts like time and materials, cost-sharing, and cost-plus arrangements are often necessary when costs cannot be accurately predicted upfront. These contracts emphasize governance, monitoring, and collaboration rather than strict price enforcement. Finally, we examined legal alternatives to contractual disputes. We emphasized that disputes are inevitable, especially in complex and high-value contracts, but litigation should be the last resort. Negotiation, mediation, and arbitration often preserve relationships, reduce costs, and lead to more productive outcomes than formal legal action. Taken together, this unit highlights that contract management is not just about legal protection. It is about structuring relationships, managing risk, and enabling long-term value creation between buyers and suppliers.